People sometimes say that science is concerned with fact and religion is concerned with opinion. And I think that when they say that, they make two mistakes. First of all, they make a mistake about the nature of science, which is more subtle and interesting than simple confrontation of unequivocal fact. There are no interesting scientific facts that are not already interpreted facts. And in order to interpret them, we need to have theoretical opinion. So there is a subtle and cyclic intertwining of experimental experience and theoretical opinion in science, a circularity that I think we have every reason to believe is benign rather than vicious, but it certainly isn't completely straightforward. Equally, religion is not merely airy-fairy opinion. People sometimes think that faith is a question of shutting your eyes, gritting your teeth, believing 6 impossible things before breakfast because some unquestionable authority tells you that's what you've got to do. Well, of course, that's not the case. In fact, religious belief does not involve intellectual suicide, and I couldn't be a religious person if indeed it required that. I want always to say to my friends that I have motivations for my religious beliefs, just as I have motivations for my scientific beliefs. Of course, there are different kinds of motivations because there are different kinds of belief. Science, in some, putting it rather crudely, is speaking about the process of the world, how things happen, and religion is concerned with whether something is going on in what is happening, questions of meaning and value and purpose. But we need both. And I think the science and religion are in fact cousins under the skin, and the main reason that they're cousins is they both share in this search for truth. Truth to be attained through well-motivated belief. And though that truth, I think, is attainable, it will never amount to absolute completeness or absolute certainty, either in science or in religion. My favorite philosopher of science is Michael Polanyi, who was, of course, also a very distinguished scientist before he became a philosopher. And in his great book, Personal Knowledge, in the preface he says, "I'm writing this book to explain how I may commit myself to what I believe to be true, knowing that it might be false." And I think that's the human condition, not only in relation to science, but in relation to all worthwhile forms of knowledge. We have motivations for our beliefs, motivations sufficient for us to commit ourselves to them, to bet our lives on them indeed, but I don't think we ever attain absolute certainty. If the experience of doing science teaches you anything, I think it teaches you that the world is surprising, beyond our powers of anticipation. In fact, that's what makes science interesting, that you never know what you're going to find round the next corner. I can make the point simply by uttering the words quantum theory. Anybody in 1899 could have proved, indeed a first-year student of philosophy could have proved that it was impossible for something to behave sometimes like a wave, spread out and flappy, and sometimes like a particle, a little bullet. Nevertheless, of course, that's how quantum entities behave, and now we understand how that comes about and how to understand it. So science teaches us the world is surprising, and that means, I think, that in relation to scientific belief and other forms of belief as well, the natural question for a scientist to ask about whatever the proposition that's being put to him or her may be is not, is it reasonable, as if we knew beforehand the shape the rationality has to take. There are too many surprises in the world. It's not reasonable to suppose that wave-particle duality. The question that we instinctively ask is a question that is both more open and also more exacting in a way. Not is it reasonable, but what makes you think that might be the case? In other words, what you tell me may be very surprising, but I'm not going to believe it unless you offer me evidence, motivating evidence for it. I'm very happy to approach my religious beliefs in that sort of way, as well as my scientific beliefs. And in this little book, I think both Nick and I are both trying to approach questions of truth in that sort of spirit.
Thank you. What does it mean to say that the sky is blue? Is it true? Why? Exploring this raises questions of physics, biology, philosophy, or even, if you're that way inclined, theology. Now, nobody's asked us why the sky is blue, but over the years people have sent us questions about science and religion. And this little book, we collect together some responses to some of the more interesting ones, together with 3 technical appendices. Now, unlike the body of the book, these appendices have extensive footnotes and references to let people drill down if they want to, whether you're a scientist, a philosopher, or anything in between. In the first appendix, we talk about anthropic fine-tuning. We set out these standard anthropic fine-tuning arguments, and we engage specifically with Lee Smolin's interesting but, I believe, ultimately flawed ideas about cosmological natural selection, pointing out some problems which were new to Lee. We also shoot a couple of rather hole-ridden fishes, one called the 747 gambit. In the second appendix, we argue that identifying the brain and the mind is a category mistake, but the mind is something like a pattern of active information rather than some kind of additional substance, and we try to expand on what we mean by active information. We also argue that if quantum mechanics is not completely deterministic, and most scientists suppose that it isn't, then nor is statistical mechanics, and nor is the working of the brain. We strongly support the notion of incompatibilist free will, and we sketch an argument about why evolution would favour its emergence. In the appendix on evolution, we correct some historical misconceptions. We discuss emergent properties and genetic reductionism, we're against it. We discuss the evolutionary benefits of religion and the evolution of cooperation. And by the way, I'm particularly delighted that we have a Darwin and a Huxley in the audience tonight. We think this kind of dialogue around the intertwining of science and religion is really important. Extremists on both sides shout at each other, gaining publicity and followers, but they bring science and religion into disrepute. Dialogue is needed for intellectual honesty, but also for practical reasons. Religion engages with people's deepest values and priorities in a way that science doesn't. We face really serious problems like global warming, which can only be addressed through deep, values-driven changes in behaviour and sound scientific understanding. Never has constructive dialogue between science and religion been more essential. And we hope that this discussion and our little book will help advance the dialogue. But we don't want the book to constrain this discussion. Any questions or comments allowed by Honora are on limits, whether or not they're anything to do with the book. We offer responses and not answers. We're not trying to tell people what to think. People may not agree with many or even any of our responses, but we hope that they will convince the intelligent reader that they are reasonable, or at least not unreasonable. Belief in God, and specifically Christian belief, may or may not be mistaken, but it cannot reasonably be said to be a delusion.